You wanna know what she said, she might just change your life.
And we are back in studio here at What She Said on Canada Talk, Sirius XM 167. And it is time now for The Legal Beat with Neuberger Partners LLP. Plain talk about legal, liberty, and social justice issues that impact all Canadians. Today we are joined by Stacey Nichols and Joseph Neuberger, I would gather of Neuberger and Partners LLP himself.
Yes, that's right.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you
Well,
very
like I
much.
said, this is great to have you on, and we know you just a couple of days ago you sent this article and you said I don't think enough time was spent on this, and I have to agree with you. And what it refers to is Canada's Auditor General is saying hundreds of inmates from maximum and medium security penitentiaries are being dumped back into communities across the country, and dumped is right because they haven't been gradually reintegrated, and this seems to be showing that they're more likely to reoffend because they haven't had that gradual process in.
That's exactly right. And this type of finding should come as no shock to those of us in the business.
Mm-hmm.
And it has really interesting issues from a financial standpoint and a management of risk standpoint, which I think our fellow citizens should be really interested in, especially with an election coming up and where we've seen the government going. Because now, over the last, I guess, decade, we've seen tremendous changes in the crime bills because the tough on crime policy
Mandatory
has been popular.
sentencing, right?
Mandatory minimums, which the Supreme Court just struck down now for gun-related offenses. All this sort of feeds into, though, that government has sought votes through a politically expedient way, which is to say we're tough on crime, and no other party is going to really oppose that. But the real challenge that comes out of that is, are we making it safer for Canadians? And we're not. We're making it more expensive for Canadians, and it's not safer because an individual who would, let's say, get a 10-year sentence, and people in the public might go, yay, that's great, but the reality is they're getting out at 7 or 8 years with very little skills, having been institutionalized for that long period of time, and will now come out and not be able to be productive members. So they're going to go back into a crime. That's really the risk that we're running. If they get out at about 3 years and have a 7-year period of parole where they're strictly supervised, involved in vocational programming, all sorts of activities, they can then be integrated. And from a risk management standpoint, we're far better off as Canadians. And the expense, what was this expense, Stacey, for housing?
It's millions of dollars more to keep these federal inmates actually in custody than it would be to release them on a parole program and reintegrate them slowly into the community. So while crime rates have been dropping in Canada, we're actually seeing an increase of federal inmates staying in the system, which of course becomes much more expensive for Canadians.
And we're talking millions and millions of dollars.
$91 million, in fact, since March 2011.
Yeah.
So, but where I get a little confused is the total number of men in federal penitentiaries has grown by 6% over the past 5 years.
Yeah.
They're staying in custody longer because they're not going out, but a lot of them aren't applying for parole when they're eligible to.
Yeah,
and they've
because they
asked
won't get it.
Is that why?
Yeah, I mean, there's such a depression about really being eligible for parole that I just think people don't even bother anymore. And then the other thing is there needs to be a little bit more of an investment in programming in the federal system. We see it completely gutted from the provincial system. So for those people who don't know, any sentence of 2 years or less is served in the provincial system. And, you know, what's the programming like, Stacey? I mean, it's virtually non-existent.
It's virtually non-existent. And while in the federal system there's much better programming for inmates, it's not mandatory that the inmates, while they're incarcerated, take advantage of the programming. But if an inmate is released on parole, it does become mandatory that they engage with whatever program that their parole officer deems necessary. So that's the difference, right? So if someone's being released straight from the institution, they may not have taken a program at all the entire time they've been in there, but at least if they're gradually released and it's mandated for them to take a program, at least they're getting something while they're
So it
reintegrated.
sounds like there's a fault, though. There's a fault somewhere in that introduction to the parole system. Like, what do we need to do to reboot the system to create a flow into the parole system?
Well, I think we need a little bit of a better understanding of what we need to do as a society to try and protect the community and make sure that those people who have committed offenses and serve a sentence which is appropriate, because we understand that there are other elements there that need to be met because offenses are serious, but we need a paradigm shift, and we need to look at it from what I consider to be a risk management system, because what we need to try and do is make the community safer over the long run for Canadians. And stiffer, harsher sentences, which the United States has experimented with for decades, does not lead to decreases in crime.
No.
And although right now our statistics are somewhat low with respect to crime, we've always been seeing a decrease over the last 2 decades. Right now we're seeing a bit of a blip, I think, with decreased rates simply due to other factors that aren't related to crime not occurring. I think it's a question of not being detected. So I think we need a bit of a paradigm shift, and we need to look at what sentencing really means and what we want to do with an offender in the long run.
Well, I mean, as far as I was always surprised that the judiciary didn't react to the minimum sentencing rules that were brought in by this government, because to me it seems to be taking their judgment into question.
Oh.
It calls into question their independence, absolutely.
Yeah, because I mean, so say, I mean, the 3 strikes, we're all familiar with
Right.
3 strikes, you're out. Okay, so but say the first 2 strikes were somebody stealing milk for their children, and the third one was the same. Then it takes away all the judge's discretion to
Absolutely.
me, and then overloads the prison cells, or the jail cells in that case. And I don't think we're addressing, when you say we need a paradigm shift, to me, the root causes of the reason that people are in jail, I would guess, would be poverty, would be one, and drugs. I don't think we need to start addressing the drug issue as an addiction as opposed to a crime.
That's right.
So, but because politically that's not an
Well, yeah.
that's
No,
not
and-
an excellent stance. So who's going to stand up and say
It's
that?
not, and the money's not there. But you said one thing which is interesting, and I've argued this before, that once we were talking about introducing a whole slew of mandatory minimum sentences, what that means to our Canadians and to the judiciary is the government is saying, we don't trust your discretion to impose what's an appropriate sentence with a particular set of facts. We're just going to treat all offenders the same. And that is not the case. And we are so lucky in Canada that we have the judicial system that we do. And you can go into a courthouse, and we can talk about courthouse security and safety issues, which recently I've talked about, but we have generally safe courthouses. We have offenders who are generally respectful within our courthouses in spite of the dilapidated condition many of these courthouses are. And you know why? Because we don't crush people. We don't take their hope and future away from them. We treat them like human beings. We need to continue to do that. And robbing judges of their own discretion to decide what's appropriate in particular circumstances, I think, undermines this wonderful system that we have.
So why didn't the judiciary, why didn't the judges speak out?
Well,
More
we've
strongly about
had
this.
some, and the Supreme Court of Canada spoke
Yes.
out very strongly now by striking down these mandatory minimums, and I think it's opened the door to look at others now as well. And I think they sent a very clear message. But, the other thing to note is, you have to look at the benches that we have in Court of Appeal and Supreme Court of Canada. All extremely bright, great merit, but we do see a bit of a shift to the right in the judges that we have. When I started practice a long time ago, I think about 22 years ago, Justice Lemaire, who was who was the Chief Justice, was very center-focused, really looked at reformative issues, and we've seen a shift from there. But our Supreme Court of Canada did speak out very strongly, and that came from a Superior Court judge who bravely struck it down, and we've seen others speak out about it. But because they have to maintain their independence, they shouldn't be speaking about social or criminal policy in the public.
So what do you think needs to happen other than, a change in government? Would probably see some change. Maybe, but not necessarily.
Maybe, and you need good leadership, so I'm not sure what our options are at the moment.
Okay, let's get into a political discussion. The other thing I wanted to ask you about when it comes to people that are in the system is the staggering disparity between Aboriginal people, who make up, 4% of the Canadian population,
Yeah.
but about 24% of the inmate population, and women, Aboriginal women in particular. I mean, what are we missing with that group as a whole?
Well, I think with Aboriginal individuals, it just goes back to really the beginnings of time and the way that Aboriginal people have unfortunately been treated. in society. I mean, because of the poverty, because of the likelihood of substance abuse, you know.
Double whammy.
It's a double whammy, and unfortunately more Aboriginals do end up in the legal system. Now, the legal system does have specific measures, and Aboriginal peoples are dealt with differently, and judges do have a mandate to consider when dealing with Aboriginal offenders, but it just doesn't take away the fact that they do end up within our criminal justice system more often than...
And you know, we shouldn't forget there's a recent look at, you know, how Aboriginal women on reserves tend to be at much greater risk of abuse
Yes.
than any other segment of our society. And so you may have, you know, fractured family settings, drug use, lack of certain other resources necessary to have people excel the way they should be excelling, and then they're subjected to abuse and they're using drugs, and that all gets into other factors. But there has been, I think, a chronic neglect of the risks that Aboriginal women face in reserves, and then why are the men more violent? What is going on? And I think it has, like Stacey said, it goes back a long time. We're trying a lot, we're throwing a lot of money at it, but there needs to be a more cohesive plan to work with our Aboriginal communities.
So what would you say to the listener out there who is going, but I want them to lock them up and throw away the key and then serve the full time and then come out? What do you think they're not getting, understanding?
Well, it's very simple. I mean, I just think you're not getting that a sudden release into society with, as we said, no programs, nothing to help them properly reintegrate. Don't forget, you're coming from a prison population, which is very, very different than society at large, right? There has to be a gradual reintegration. And, you know, it's simple. And the statistics show, even, you know, Correction Services Canada, they do their own studies all the time. The studies consistently show that offenders who are released into society suddenly without any parole are much more likely to commit crimes and violent crimes than those who are slowly integrated under supervision of a parole officer and with the programs that they offer.
There needs to be a slight re-education of the public, though, because there is that perception that parole is, in essence, a get-out-of-jail-free card as opposed to a reintegration process.
Yeah, and it's not. Parole officers and probation officers take their jobs very seriously. There are regimes in place for programming, which is vocational, educational, substance abuse. But what I would say to the person on the street who says, you know, I want to lock them up for 10 years or 12 years, okay, let's say you're on the street now, 10 years from now. You don't know if that offender is walking beside you.
Yeah.
And if that offender has had no efforts whatsoever at rehabilitation thrown at him, nothing, then you're likely to be at risk of that person maybe stealing from you or doing something. So this is where I talk about risk management. It's educating the public. We need to manage risk so that the public is safer. Locking somebody away for 10 years doesn't do it. There are certain crimes where you need long penalties. We get that. There are heinous offenses. But beyond that, the majority of offenses, when you're talking about drug offenses and certain others, you know, we have to take a more of an enlightened approach and try and educate the public that what's better is that we have people integrated into our community so that we can all be safer.
Joseph Neuberger, Stacey Nichols, thank you very much for coming in and talking to us today. And
Pleasure.
we'll be back with more plain talk about legal liberty and social justice issues that impact us all. What we need to know and want to talk about every Thursday from now on. One or the other, sometimes both.
Sometimes both. You'll get a mixed bag.
Click the channel subscribe button for full-length interviews and more from What She Said here on YouTube.